Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income, the first edition of the new format. As you can see, we are all on Zoom. We're in a Zoom meeting here, and we're going to see how the discussion goes. One of the advantages of this format is that everyone gets to participate. Everyone gets to participate. Found a problem already. There we go. I was listening to myself talk. Yeah, so we're going to feel this out. It's going to feel a little bit different than our previous discussions have, but I think we've got great people here, and we can have a really interesting discussion. So the topic this week is full employment. So what does it mean for the economy to be at full employment? Why do we care about the economy being at full employment, and why does our economic policy try to achieve full employment, or make judgments based on kind of the level of employment in the economy? So these are the kinds of questions we're going to be asking, and some of us read a couple articles. The first one is from The Conversation, by J.L. Zagorski from Ohio State University, and it's called "What is Full Employment? An Economist Explains the Latest Jobs Data." So this is from May of 2018, so it's actually not the latest jobs data. And if we had the latest jobs data, it probably wouldn't be valid anyway because of coronavirus. So the data is, whatever the most recent data we've compiled is probably out of date, pretty quickly at this point. So we're going to be talking about the world as it existed previously. The second article, we can get into what this means for where we are now as well. The second article is an article from The Atlantic by Gillian White from May of 2017, entitled "Full Employment, Are We There Yet?" So we'll get into some quotes from the article, and people on YouTube, hopefully you'll be able to see them on the screen as we do here, or you'll be able to see them. The question is whether they'll be legible. I had some issues with that hopefully have been sorted out. Yeah, so I want to start by going around the room and getting people's initial thoughts on full employment and basic income. Is full employment, why is full employment important? Why do we care about it? How does basic income affect, the level of employment in the economy, and how does it affect how we care about the level of employment in the economy? So we'll go, so there's 5 of us, which is a good number. So we'll go Bethany, Avi, Derek, and then Joan, my mom. Hopefully Steve can get back in soon because he was here moments ago. Yeah, so go ahead, Bethany.
I think Steve is still here, maybe.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Oh, you're just not showing up on the video because you don't have a video. Yeah, that's good. Okay, so Steve, you will go last after my mom.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I think one of the interesting things that we can see more clearly right now is that the level of how basic income would affect employment depends on where the economy otherwise is. And what I mean by that is, if the economy is inefficiently employing too many people, then it might decrease the number of people employed. Or if the economy would otherwise have a jobs guarantee that employs people inefficiently, then it would decrease that. But if the economy is underemploying people in terms of production because people don't have money to spend on things that they would otherwise be doing, which is something we're kind of worried about in the upcoming months and years, then basic income might increase the number of people employed because it would be it stimulates spending. People would have the money to spend, and then people would be employed in the work needed to produce the things that they want to buy. So I think it kind of depends on where the economy's at before you think about adding the basic income.
Okay, yep.
So my kind of viewpoint is, I'm looking at the title of the second article now, and it asks whether or not the labor market has reached its full potential. And that got me thinking that, full employment and the market working at maximum efficiency might be 2 very different things. Because I would argue that if the market's operating at maximum efficiency, that probably happens after a certain amount of jobs have been automated away, only because machines are a lot less, you don't have to pay machines or whatever. So I think that's really like a distinction we should make. And yeah, I guess that's just my opening thoughts.
Yeah, Derek.
Well, this has been interesting. I only got to read the first article thoroughly, and I just got the chance to skip through the second. But I mean, like many terms in economics, it sounds simple, and then it turns out that many experts disagree over what full employment means and what it's tracking. So going from that first article, which was very helpful, it seems that a lot of people are in some way actually looking for some kind of optimum level of employment. They concede that full employment is not a possibility, given that even in World War II, it was only at, only went down to 2%, 1.8%, something like that. So yeah, I think clearly in the context of basic income, especially, you start thinking about alternative goals for the economy. And it's clear that this is the current goal. And that seems relevant. It seems relevant that we would want consensus on what the goal of the economy was. This is one option.
Yeah, it's certainly one of the big ones that we pay attention to. Yeah, so go ahead. Who's next?
Me?
You, yes.
Yeah. I was interested in I only read the first article also, but I was interested that there's never been full unemployment. I mean, we've never had, full employment. We've never had zero unemployment. And the idea of tracking full employment seems problematical to me because so many people are not counted. I mean, it's hard to know what full employment would actually look like. And if you add in basic income, that's not adding to the idea of employment per se, but as somebody else said, it's adding to the idea of, if you had a job, you'd be spending into the economy. So if you had basic income, you'd also be spending into the economy, even if you didn't have a job. So those things seem now to be not in opposition, but complicates picture for me.
Yeah, Steve.
Yeah, it seems like the definition of full employment is all over the map. I was reading some MMT job guarantee people who think that not only are we at full employment, but all those employees are operating at full tilt and the economy is producing as much as it possibly can. Therefore, if there was an introduction of a basic income of any size, inflation would instantly begin.
Yeah, that's interesting. I do hear MMT people talking about how basic income is going to necessarily cause inflation, but I don't hear a lot of them saying that they think the economy is already at full employment. Like many of them are kind of on a mission to show the world how to bring the economy to full employment. Is kind of the sense that I get from the MMT group. That's kind of what everyone else sees too. Yeah, so. Guys, remember your hand raising buttons if you want to raise your hand and say something. So I think, I think you guys are right that the notion of full employment, the idea that someone who's not working is unemployed, it kind of implies that, there's a going rate for jobs and they're unable to find a job at that going rate and they want one at, that particular rate. If they didn't care about how much they were being paid, then they'd be happy to work for free or something like that. They'd be able to find something that they could do where nobody was paying them. But we've kind of defined, some parameters around what counts as a job and what doesn't, what counts as being employed and what doesn't. So when you think of kind of the labor market in abstract terms of, paying people to do things, the idea of employment doesn't really fit into that broad framework unless you set these parameters, because you could be paying someone to do something or not, or there's a whole continuum, and it's the idea of that there's some kind of line between being employed and unemployed, is kind of, well, we kind of codified in our laws too, right, there's a legal, you're either legally employed or you're not, that kind of thing, which gets really tricky because people are arguing all the time about, should Uber drivers count as being employees and, that kind of thing. So So I think there's a lot of questions here, and of course, when we talk about basic income, we're talking about providing people a source of income that's not tied to a job. And one of the reasons why we see employment, or our society sees employment as being so important, is that jobs are conventionally the way in which we expect people to get their income. So we design our policies around that, and we design our framework of what we're trying to get the economy to do kind of around that. So if you're thinking, like, if people don't have jobs, they don't have money, then unemployment is a really big problem, especially if they want those jobs, because that means they need money. So that's why they're looking for the job. So yeah, does anyone have any more thoughts before we get into, yeah, Avi, go ahead.
So I just want to make a quick distinction between the unemployment rate and the underemployment rate. So the unemployment rate, which Article 1 lists as 3.9%, for that rate, you're counted as employed if you make more than $20 a week, which is like a really, really low amount.
Yeah.
Whereas the underemployment rate, which I just looked up, was 12.5%. And that's like a huge difference between 3.9 and 12.5%. And the underemployment rate takes into account, whether or not people have like full-time jobs. So back to what Alex was talking about with like Uber drivers and such, I would not count Uber drivers as being, if that's their only job, as being employed, especially if they're not getting like the 40 hours a week or whatever. So.
Yeah, so that's really interesting too. What does it mean to be employed enough? Are your wages high enough? Are your hours high enough? That kind of thing, to be really employed. And this can be, people argue about this stuff from different sides of different situations. For example, Uber might agree with you, Avi, and say like, no, these people are not employees, they're contractors, they spend some time, and therefore they shouldn't get, all the benefits that get guaranteed to full-time employees or something like that. We don't have to provide health insurance or whatever. So there's depending on the interests of the people involved, sometimes you might frame something as employment, and sometimes you might frame it as not employment. So I could imagine the same group of Uber drivers saying that they're not really employed when they're complaining about the fact that they're not employed enough, or they don't have enough work or enough hours, and in one context, and then maybe in another context they're saying they are employed because they want health insurance benefits or something like that. So there's interesting politics that have emerged around this too. But I think it's worth asking how. So there's there's a trade-off between labor and leisure. Nobody's working at their job 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. At the very least, they're sleeping some of that time, right? So you wouldn't want 100% employment in the sense that nobody ever does anything but work at a job. So there's a certain amount of employment that feels like it's enough, and you don't want to force people to have too much. But it's really interesting that kind of it's such a stark thing. Like, we've really defined it to be like a certain acceptable amount, and too much is bad and too little is bad. And I feel like a lot of that is tied to wages. And in the real world, like, leisure is a really good thing. And if we don't have to work as much, if we don't have to do as many things for other people that are things that we wouldn't ordinarily spend our time doing, then that's a really great thing. We can spend our time doing the things that we want to be doing. So it's interesting that and you can kind of understand why we don't talk about this labor-leisure trade-off in our society. It's because when people have leisure, they're also poor. They don't have money. So basic income, having something like that can maybe help shift how we think of not having a job, what that's like, and even how we think about people who don't have jobs. Yeah, go ahead, Mom.
Yes, Alex. Oh, yeah, I raised my hand, but you didn't see it.
That's why I called on you, because your hand.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was going to go back and question the idea of employment. The idea the definition of full employment, I mean, it seems to be contingent on not only hours or whether or not you're getting benefits, but also how much you're making. I mean, a contractor, an Uber driver, somebody who's just doing freelance work could make enough money to live on and beyond somebody who's working at McDonald's or something. So are they both fully employed? I mean, I'm not sure what the parameters are here about what is full. And it's not just time. It's not just straight 8 hours a day. I'm not sure how they measure full employment, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, so I think a lot of these questions don't have definitive answers. You know, and sometimes in certain contexts they do, but it's somewhat arbitrary. Like, are you working over 40 hours for a particular person or something like that? Yeah, Bethany, go ahead.
I was just going to say something similar, that it's interesting if we end up defining a job in terms of hours, like fully employed as working at least 40 hours a week, because the thing we actually care the most about is the income that they're making. So I guess we could define it as like earning the poverty line or above or something like that. But I agree with Joan and you that it's not really clear exactly where the line should be if we're trying to count it.
Yeah, Derek.
I mean, a complicating factor would be that once economists decide that this is a good and noble thing for the economy to be doing, there may be all sorts of contexts in which you hear the term used. So in the sense of how employed should a person be, this may actually kind of be a way of referring to, I mean, if you're unemployed, there's a lot of social stigma with that. You're basically an out-group member. And if we're trying to say we're raising the employment rate, in a sense, we're trying to say, well, we want everyone to participate in this society of ours. And then, of course, you know, we're very familiar with people using the term to refer essentially to the overall health of the economy. So, you know, you see it used as a political football and not actually referring to the actual, you know, there's no precise definition of it.
Yeah, and I think, you know, most of the time people just take for granted, oh, you know, too much unemployment, that's bad. You know, that means the economy is doing poorly. You know, we need to bring employment up. We need to, you know, make sure there are jobs for everyone, that kind of thing. Yeah, go ahead, Mom.
Yeah, that what Derek said is really interesting. The idea that you're on the outs if you're not employed, and that usually involves looking like you're working, even if, you know, you just, I mean, some people just get up and go somewhere at 8 o'clock in the morning and then come home to look like, I mean, it reminds me of an ant colony. It's like, are you part of this colony? Are you part of the society? Are you doing this kind of 9 to 5 activity? When people get laid off, they're often given offices that are, you know, like layoff offices where they can go in and use empty cubicles to look for a job from 9 to 5, so that they look like they're looking for a job, and that's a job. So a lot of it is what full employment has to do with the stigma of not being employed, also not just the economic, you know, results of being employed and spending money into the economy and all of that. I like that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think a lot of these, by the way, you can lower your hand back down. I can do it for you, but yeah, there you go.
Yeah, turn off my blinker. Yeah.
Yeah, turn your blinker off. Your blinker's on. Yeah, so yeah, I think a lot of these kind of judgments about people who aren't working, you know, that comes from, you know, having to provide an incentive, a social incentive for people to contribute. And that works in, you know, like small scale societies and tribes and stuff like that. But once you get to, you know, billions of people on the planet or whatever, people don't, like, this is a point that Derek brings up all the time, that, you know, money is for people you don't know. And most of us don't know each other. So money is incredibly important in providing incentives for people to work. So it seems a little bit odd to me that we've kind of kept up these kind of moral judgments about people not working. Part of it, I think, is probably that in our society, since people depend on jobs and wages for income, if you know that someone's not working, you're worried that you're going to have to support them and you resent them for that. So that maybe reinforces some of the existing kind of social pressures and stuff that you would be putting on that person. Yeah, go ahead, Bethany.
So, I mean, yeah, just to follow up on what you're saying, people usually like to signal that they have money in different kinds of ways and are ashamed, and others aren't usually as impressed if they don't have access to money. And as you pointed out, in our culture, especially if you're unemployed, you typically don't have a lot of money, or you often don't. But I think there's even more to it than that. I think there's other things that people want to signal, like they might be signaling that they're conscientious, they can show up reliably for something, which means they might be able to show up reliably in a relationship, or they have skills that they've honed, or that they could also use like for other things. So I think there's a bunch of things that get grouped together. So I'm not surprised at all that people still have these attitudes about employed versus unemployed. And I've even noticed among the very few, I don't know very many uber wealthy people who really wouldn't need to work. But the one that I do know, I always find it interesting that he also is always like doing something. Like sometimes he's working quite long hours at something. Sometimes he's just sort of doing something that kind of looks like a job, but he never just like doesn't work. And so I feel like this idea that you're supposed to work even extends to people who don't need it. In terms of this, it's more impressive in our culture. It's more impressive, at least especially for men, or people who aren't raising kids, to have a job, even if they don't need the money. So I think there's both that you're showing that you have money and that you're showing other kinds of skills.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think you're right that it's so ingrained in our society, that it's kind of like it's taken for granted that being a hard worker, in terms of like labor market job, work, and being able to provide for your family or for yourself or that kind of thing, being able to be self-sufficient, as it were, is like just one of the virtues that is normal for people to strive to kind of cultivate in themselves. Yeah, it's just I hope I like that we're questioning it now. Let's put it that way. Avi, go ahead.
But sorry,
I'm calling it Avi.
All right, but I want to.
All right, Bethany, go ahead. Bethany.
Oh, yep.
Just quickly, I want to say that I don't think it's just that we've gotten used to it as an idea. Like I think that it's right now one of the main ways that people show off other talents and skills. It's not the only way. Like people can have hobbies where they do that too, but right now it's a genuine way that people show those things. So I think that's part of it too.
So I
yeah.
definitely agree with Bethany here. I think that, a job isn't really just like a vessel to get money. A lot of times, I know Jordan Peterson in particular talks about this a lot, where a lot of times people build their identity around their job. So even if they don't particularly rely on it to make income, a lot of times you'll have people who are super wealthy as like a CEO or whatever, just stay as a CEO only because that's just a huge part of their life since they're at their work, 40 hours a week or whatever. So that's also another factor to consider, I feel like.
Yeah, I think these are all examples of ways in which we kind of get stuck in this pattern, right? So it's kind of self-reinforcing. If this is what we make people do with our economic policy, this is also how people form their identities. And then so it's a mutually reinforcing thing. So Mom, you have your hand up? You're muted. You can unmute yourself to speak, or I can unmute you. You're muted. Do you want to unmute yourself? Lower left-hand corner.
Okay, there we go. So going back to things that Bethany said and you and Avi about the identity issue. I mean, and also, at least in my generation, it was also important for a man to be the provider. I mean, that was a big part of an identity for a man, to have a job. And you're always asked, what do you do in any social gathering? It was not about who you are, what you like, it's what do you do? And then whatever your job is, that's you're defined as that. That was very strong. I mean, I just watched a documentary where they're in a trial, and this, really monstrous murder guy is, they're talking about his background, and the woman, the sister of the woman he was married to, said, well, we all thought that he was good. I mean, he had a job. And it's like, I thought of you, Alex. It's like that was the best thing that could happen. He had a job. That's the best thing they could hope for. Yeah, that's my contribution. Somebody went off here.
That's a good point. Derek, go ahead.
As long as we're on the identity question, it's also worth pointing out that, I mean, to some extent, I mean, I think Bethany is right that we, it's a signaling function. Like I'm showing that I'm, a good person and I can contribute, and to some extent that can never really go away and has always been with us. But then there's this question of conflating any kind of work with waged labor, right? Jobs and employment, which are just two thoroughly different things. And like some of you pointed out, I mean, if you're a caregiver or a mother, that there's so much work that goes into that. It's not employment. What Alex is doing, hosting a group like this, is a lot of work, but it's not. No one's paying him to do it that I know of. So I think that it's strange how I guess I just wanted to note that, like, I think to a certain extent we should question the notion that people are compelled to build their identity around their work, but we should also question the conflation of non-waged work with waged work.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Most of the work that we do is not paid. Most of the important things that we do are not paid, and the only reason we pay people to do things is if, for whatever reason, there's certain work that's not getting done that we want to get done. So, like there are these, in our society, there are these notions that you get paid based on how much value you contribute or something like that. It's like, no, well, you get paid based on how much you need to pay the person to get them to do the thing, if you want them to do the thing. So I think we've had a good discussion here, and I think we have the right perspective to start looking at some quotes from the article. And here's the part where I switch us over to speaker view, so hopefully you guys can actually read the quotes. But yeah, as we read these quotes, let's think about not just what does it mean to be at full employment, or how do we achieve full employment? Are the people talking about this right, that the economy is not at full employment, or that kind of thing? Let's think about it from the lens of why do we care about full employment? Is it about more than the money, especially when we're talking about the economic side of things? So let me bring up the first quote here. So we are on speaker view now, and hopefully this will work. Oh, whoops. So this is from the first article. Oh, did we lose the highlight, or did we just scroll? So no, there it is. We made everything bigger a few minutes ago, so some of the stuff is off the edge. So the unemployment rate includes anyone 16 or older who is actively searching for work in its calculation, the calculation of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which means students, retirees, and others not in the labor force are excluded. So this speaks to an expectation about who's working, who should be expected to work. We don't expect children to work. We don't expect retired people to work, or I shouldn't say we don't expect retired people to work, because that's kind of, if you're retired, you're not working, that's what it means. But we don't expect older people to work. So this suggests to me that, at least on some level, our society is making a calculation about, even if it's just a rough calculation, about how much work we actually do need. There's this assumption that we don't need that it's not beneficial to work children to the bone, or to work elderly people to the bone, or something like that. And where do we get that? Where do we get that expectation from, or where do we get that assumption from? And why doesn't it shift as we get more efficient in our productivity, or something like that? It has seemed pretty consistent for a while that we kind of expect some representative of, or if not two representatives from most households to be employed. So I'll throw that out there. Anyone have any comments on this quote? We can get to another quote. That's fine too. Avi is saying it still looks pixelated.
It does, okay. Yeah. It's worse than before. I think it depends maybe on how overloaded your computer or internet are, possibly.
Yeah, it might. So
Oh, that's better.
It is?
Yeah,
Okay,
but
I didn't do
maybe
anything.
I'm not sure why.
Okay. So yeah, anyone have any thoughts on this quote? It's basically just to kind of summarize it, it's just, acknowledging without really explaining that there are certain people, certain classes of people or demographics that we expect to get a job and ones that we don't. So it's just it's an interesting thing to point out. So full employment just means within this subset. Yeah, go ahead, Derek.
Just a question. When it says that it includes people who are looking for work, does that mean it doesn't include people who are not looking for work? People who, for somehow we have information that they've given up, like they were trying but then gave up. Does it include that?
No. It includes the people who want jobs. So the idea is that if for whatever reason you are not looking for a job, then you are not among the class of people who want jobs who don't have one, right? So maybe that's because you just got really depressed and gave up or something like that. And that's something we talk about a lot too. How the headline unemployment numbers are not necessarily representative of what's actually like the people who actually would benefit from having jobs if they felt that the jobs were available in the world. Okay, I'm looking at the live stream to see if our article is showing up, and I don't think it is, but that's all right. Yeah, so Mom, go ahead. You're muted. You should unmute yourself. When you speak, you should unmute yourself, and then when you're done speaking, you should mute yourself again.
Okay, got it. That classification, the parameters of over 16, not retired, not a child. I mean, that seems maybe coming from an older view of this idea of, are you able-bodied, or are you, within the society, are you able to work? And I think that, child labor laws and, the Industrial Revolution took away the idea that children should be working. They were up until then, I mean, in farms and whatnot. But I think that whole idea of whether or not you're able-bodied also plays into people who get disability. How do they determine whether or not someone is able to work? So this is sort of a broad sweep of what they consider to be able, what people they consider to be able to work. Retired maybe because they're elderly, they're not able. Children not able. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure why that has held for so long. I mean, in view of maybe remote, like we're doing now, remote activity, and automation, that, the ways that people can work that don't necessarily include their body. Yeah, so maybe that's an outmoded category in a certain way.
Yeah, go ahead, Bethany.
Yeah, two things. I guess in response to Joan, we also seem to have this idea that changes over time about whether people should have certain periods of their life where they get to enjoy or relax. So I think the idea of being able-bodied was part of how the retirement came about, but now that people are healthier longer, there's also this idea that it's okay to enjoy a certain period of time once you've sort of earned it by working a long time, even if you are able-bodied. And then and we've expanded that to kids too. I mean, children used to work more, and then we passed laws against that and felt that they should be learning things or, enjoying life in a different way. So I think we've had different definitions in addition to the able-bodiedness. And then I originally raised my hand, Alex, because I was wondering how they know who's looking for work. Is it something about, do they have a way of how do they track that to have an estimate?
Yeah, so they look at people who are applying for jobs and not getting them, I guess it is the main thing. And a lot of times people who are unemployed are, collecting benefits, and those benefits come with work requirements, or at least requirements that you're looking for a job and you have to demonstrate that and that kind of thing. I'm not, like I don't know the exact specifics of how they do it, but they can generally get a sense of who's actually actively looking for a job and who's not. Do that kind of stuff. Yeah. Your hand is still up. Do you want to talk more? Okay. You guys ready for the next quote? Let's go over here. See if this one's actually on the screen. Okay, and fade in. So does this mean that the economy is at full employment? They're talking about unemployment rates being low, as shown in kind of the graph up there. Does this mean that the economy is at full employment? What is full employment anyway? To the typical person on Main Street, the idea of full employment usually means everyone in the country is working, which would imply a jobless rate of essentially 0. This has never happened. Yeah, and I think that makes perfect sense, because there's always going to be some people who are, in between jobs and that kind of thing. And it's also, the article will get into this a little bit more further down, but it's also the case that if everybody were, if we tried to push to employ everyone, then there just wouldn't be enough flexibility that the employers could find employees and that kind of thing, and it might drive up wages in a way that kind of is self-perpetuating if we just kind of like forced that to happen for a really long time. So yeah, nobody's raising their hand. Anyone have any thoughts on this quote? We'll get to the next one. All right, we'll go to the next one. Maybe we'll even get through all of them today. So this one says, the lowest unemployment rate in the US ever achieved was 1.2% in 1944. That was during the middle of World War II, when millions of men were drafted to fight and their jobs were filled by women. So I think this is a great example of, hey, you achieved the thing that we're always saying we want to achieve. Really low unemployment, or employing as many people as possible. But it also corresponds with something really bad that's happening. You're putting all those resources, you're putting all that labor, and you're putting all these other resources into fighting a war. It's killing people, and destroying infrastructure, and just basically you're building things to either blow up or to blow other things up, or like it's not, you're not advancing kind of the human condition. So clearly there's more we should want from the economy than just full employment. If the way to get to full employment is to start world wars, that does not seem optimal to me. Yeah, so let's see. Anyone have any comments on that? Yeah, Derek, go ahead.
I mean, I agree with your comments, and I think it's sort of worth imagining what that's like, what that means really to have, out of a population of say 300 million, that almost 99% of them are participating in formal labor for either the state or for various other production, going at, that's your entire nation is going at full speed doing something. And so I don't know, it to me is actually kind of a frightening picture to imagine that. And then it does seem strange that this is a sort of a goal that people want for its own sake.
Yeah, and then it can call into question some of the other things we try to do that to reach full employment that might look innocuous on the surface, or we kind of take for granted, or stuff like that, because it's not automatic that full employment is a good thing, and especially given what we were talking about before, where more leisure makes people better off too. Like the idea that we should even be in a society where people are wanting jobs. So here's another way to think about full employment, is that if you talk about people looking for jobs at a certain rate and not being able to get that job, then you could say, well, what if you attack it from the other end and reduce the need for people to go out and get that money somehow? And that's an effect that basic income has. So yeah, Bethany, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I guess I was just going to say that I find World War II though like a useful thought experiment, even though I wasn't there, to think about whether we really need people's labor now. Because I think a flip side is that when people are unemployed, we often blame it on them. So I imagine, like, would they be unemployed in World War II? And if not, how much is it really them not going and doing the work that the economy so desperately needs them to do versus the economy not really desperately needing them to do it? And there's a lot of things that I think through in that sort of way, like all the extra education requirements that many jobs have that don't actually seem that needed for the job, or like just the way that people are basic. Yeah, so there's lots of things like that where if we were really desperate for the labor, things would look different. So I find it kind of interesting to think about that. And I guess a side point I'm bringing up there too is like the amount of education that you've needed has gone up and up and up, which makes unemployment look lower because those students don't count as unemployed. But if you spend the first, 5 to 10 to 15 years of your what used to be maybe a time when you were considered employed in school, that's a way to have fewer people in the labor market because maybe you don't need them, but still looking like they're doing something productive.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there's often this assumption that that full employment in the economy corresponds pretty close to, if not exactly, with full economic output, full production, right? So I think, even right now with the global pandemic and coronavirus, we see that we have resources. We're able to mobilize resources to help people at the same time that we're reducing the amount of labor in the economy. Like, this is happening right before our eyes, that we're able to send people money, we're able to provide other benefits, we're able to shore up the financial markets and the supply chains and that kind of thing. I mean, obviously it's not going swimmingly, but we are able to activate this stuff, and that is a sign that we weren't making the best use of our resources before this happened. Because if you imagine a world in which the economy is at full output, or it's reaching its full potential for the benefit of the people, then something like coronavirus happens. Now, kind of necessarily, everyone has to get by, or society as a whole has to get by being a little bit poorer. And we see kind of the opposite of that happening now. And I think that just reveals that we weren't reaching our full economic potential before. Yeah, Avi, go ahead.
So I definitely agree with Bethany here, in which I feel like there are a lot more people looking for jobs than there are jobs available. And this leads to a problem where there are artificial barriers put in place. I mean, for example, 30 years ago, all you needed was like a high school degree and you should have been able to find a job. But now more and more, even like internship positions require like a bachelor's degree. And I know personally, like I'm in the process of looking for an internship and a job right now. And like I found internships that require like PhD level experience, which I think is kind of absurd. And then there's also like experience level as like an artificial barrier, where jobs will say, oh, we don't want to train you, we want someone with like 2 or 3 or 4 years of experience. And I just feel like this cycle will get worse and worse until we like address the issue that there are going to be people who are unemployed because there just aren't that many jobs available.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, the number of jobs available. Well, there's actually a lot of interesting points related to what you just said. In terms of thinking about the number of jobs available, at any given time, there's probably an infinite number of jobs available. Like if I'm a business or a certain kind of business, I could probably benefit from additional workers if they came cheap enough. So I might even create job listings that say, hey, people with PhDs who want to work $10 an hour for no benefits. Yeah, we've got plenty of openings, right? So it's not just the number of openings. It's kind of like what you were talking about, that they don't necessarily need. They're making a trade-off too, right? Like, oh well, if we have to pay you, what you would think is a decent wage, then it's not worth it to us. So we won't hire you. That kind of thing. So it's not just about the number of job openings and the number of people who are looking for jobs. And I think when Bethany brought up the point about the increased credentials, it's not an arbitrary thing. It's the idea that you're a business and you have to throw away some of those resumes. You have to reject so many people. So you might as well, like, the fact that you went through a lot of graduate school and put yourself through a lot of other stuff, it's a sign of something. Maybe some of the other people would have been just as good, but you can throw out that whole pile and you still get, like, now you get all your low paid PhDs, and that's great for your company too. So it's, like, I don't know that we can just go in and say, hey, we need to start removing these absurd requirements, because those absurd requirements are a function of the market, a function of companies needing to find ways to reject people. So yeah, it's a little more, it's a little bit tricky. Yeah, go ahead, Avi.
So, I mean, I would even argue that if we look at like the same job listing from like, today versus like 30 years ago, there definitely is a difference in, I guess, the requirements that they require, only because more and more people have, undergraduate degrees and graduate degrees. So they have to like put in a filter to kind of artificially sort. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. The more people who get the credential, the more you have to figure out new credentials, new ways to filter people beyond what you were doing before. And this also, of course, this phenomenon is kind of, if you look at it, it's kind of obvious that this is happening. But it really kind of shows that the argument that people should, we can solve this problem, or we can solve the unemployment problem by just educating everybody more. Well, no, that just, it furthers this process of kind of having to find new ways of filtering people out. It's not a product. It's not because people don't have enough education that they don't have jobs. It's because we had to, the employers had to eliminate, a lot of the candidates, and that was the way they chose to do it. Yeah, Bethany, go ahead.
Just to emphasize that, I feel like this is an error that a lot of politicians at least appear to make, where they talk about how, well, currently, if you have a college degree, you make X amount more, or you have these jobs available to you. So what we need to do is we need to get people, say, in poverty, or just more people in general, to get college degrees. And then they assume it's going to extrapolate, like then they're going to make that much more, or like somehow new jobs are just going to be there for them. But like Avi pointed out, it's actually like a screening technique given a sort of constrained resource. And if more people have college degrees, then it's going to be grad degrees that they need, or if they're PhDs or something else beyond that. So I think I just want to emphasize that I noticed this mistake made quite a bit in general conversation and in politics, where you extrapolate from what currently helps you get to the head of that sorting process, and then just assume you can scale that to everybody, and then there'll be more prosperity, which doesn't really make sense.
Yeah, and this is sometimes called the fallacy of composition, right? So it's the idea that if you stand up in a baseball stadium, you're going to get a better view. But if everybody stands up, then nobody has a better view, and everyone's really tired from standing. So standing is the getting a graduate degree or whatever.
Yeah, but I guess the non-stupid view that I think people have is that the reason you need the college degree is that there's actually some skill that like is needed for that job. And if more people had that skill, there would be more of those jobs available. Like we would just want to use that skill, and there would be more of those jobs available. I don't think that's true a lot of the time, but I think that's the way it makes sense to people when they're talking about it.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's this intuition that people have a lot to offer, and if we just unlock their potential, all of society is going to be better off. Get people up to where they're going to contribute the most, and then employ them, and good things will happen, or something like that. And I think that kind of argument ignores the fact that people are doing very, very valuable work outside of the labor market. And if you force them into the labor market, sometimes you're actually paying more of a cost than if you would let them, spend their time in other ways that are less constrained by, maybe social expectations or things that are observably, kind of in conventional ways, contributing to a business or something like that. Derek, go ahead, or Bethany, yeah.
Just one last point on this. There are situations where it seems to be that there isn't a fallacy of composition. Like, at least what I've seen is that some data on educating girls in societies where girls are not educated, it doesn't just like lower the bar for everyone. It actually can be a marker of getting the whole society to be less poor. Like, a lot of other things happen, like number of kids people are having changes and things like that. Age of marriage changes. So I'm not saying that it's always that way with education, but I think we're seeing something else. Yeah, I just want to add that point.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point too, because I think education generally always makes people better off. But when you orient your education system towards preparing people for these jobs, then what you're doing, even though it's called education, it's not really necessarily the kind of education that benefits society anymore. It starts to look more like job training, or training someone to be like a cog, an input into the economic machine, or something like that. And that can be an important thing. We do need inputs to our economic machine, but the idea that making someone an input for the sake of being an input without necessarily resulting in better output or a better performing economy, just because you have that expectation that people are kind of going through the motions of performing this work, then you kind of run into problems. So I love education. I want our education to be so much better, and I think the fact that it's tied so much to the labor market and jobs is really holding back our potential to educate our people. Derek, you had your hand up. Do you still have a comment, or has it been too long?
I think it's been too long. Go for it.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Well, does anyone have any more thoughts before we move on to the next quote? Yeah, Mom.
Joan has.
Go ahead and unmute your. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, okay. So now a couple of things. The first thing was about, the inflation of college education, I guess you could say, that everybody needs to have a degree, and that it's not high school degree. Now it has to be a bachelor's at least, and so forth. That also creates, the kind of academic industry too. I mean, there's now this sort of ecosystem of schools that need to exist in order to feed those degrees. I mean, I see that in MFA programs. When I graduated from graduate school, there was probably 3 MFA programs in the country. Now there are hundreds. I mean, and they're turning out writers who will never really, find a job writing, but they need to teach. So then they go into MFA programs to teach. I mean, the whole thing is kind of a vicious circle that's designed to keep everybody in that system employed. And they have to create these programs on one side to feed the other side. That was one thought I had when we're talking about education inflation. The other thing was what Bethany said about, when more women join the workforce. Of course, that was also displacing men, and that was actually, a complaint that I heard quite a bit at that time, that women were taking the jobs of men. So they had to create more jobs that in order to, adjust to the inflation of women getting educated and then taking jobs for men. So, there are a lot of these processes, I guess you could say, or circles are in place from maybe 20, 30 years ago that we don't really, it keeps going. It's like you say, that the standing up of one person, but everybody keeps standing up. There isn't any thought about how it might be if people started sitting down, because nobody wants to do that. So it just has to increase, right?
Now we have to stand on boxes and then sit on people's shoulders.
Right. Yeah.
I think it's a really funny thing when we design our economy and set the parameters for our economy in such a way that people have to fight over these jobs. There's a reason why we have incentives. You could imagine a scenario in which people aren't working enough, and then maybe you gotta make it so they don't have as much money, withhold some money from them, lower the basic income, increase their taxes or something to get them to have to earn the money back in the labor market. But that's not what we're doing. We're not withholding basic income from people because we desperately need the labor. We're withholding basic income from people because we don't really understand how the economy works. And we're causing this situation where people are desperate for jobs, which is what we would want to do if we really we're desperate for the labor. But we're creating the situation, and then we're panicking and trying to solve this problem of how to get them jobs instead of solving the problem of, well, what did we do to force them to need to earn that money in the first place? So it's just a really interesting thing, and you know, it's the same thing with, you know, immigrants. Oh no, they're going to take our jobs. You know, like there's something very wrong with our economy when we hear about people who are going to do our work for us, and we think of that as a bad thing, right? There's just it like you don't need to know economics or anything to know that, you know, the less stuff you have to do for other people, the more freedom you have to spend your time how you want. And maybe that's working on something really important and working really hard, but you know, it's you get to choose more if you have more financial freedom. Yeah, Avi, go ahead.
So just quickly going back to the topic of education, also I've noticed recently that a lot of majors, you can like replace the last year of classes with like an internship credit or like research credit and stuff, which like I guess it's nice to have some experience going out of college, but if the point of college is to learn, it just seems kind of like that last year is almost like wasted in a sense.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. In some ways, you can think of college as a job where your wage is negative. So you're paying them in order to do the work. And then there's this weird point where suddenly you flip over and now they're paying you, right? And you know, like there's a long history of apprenticeships and stuff like that. Like you gotta train up and put in your work and, you know, that kind of thing. But then when you have like your last semester or your last year is an internship, it really is a job that you are paying to be able to do because you're still paying the school tuition, probably. I don't know. But you know, it's funny that we've set up our incentives in such a way that yeah, I mean, we even frame it this way, that you're kind of investing in yourself by paying for school and going to school, and then you kind of get the return later, that kind of thing. But so the carrot there is this promise of future returns. You get people to do these things for the promise of future returns. And when it's in the context of an academic environment, it can look, you know, like that's maybe a little bit more understandable because you're providing them with tools they need and stuff like that. That's still kind of true in the internship, but now you're also doing you're doing something for the benefit of the employer, that kind of thing. So it's interesting where in our social norms we kind of draw the line between work that you should be paid for and work that you should pay to have to do or do for free or something like that. And I think there's a lot of tension there. Like some people are like, you know, internships, you know, that's how you got to do it. And then some people are like, oh, this is exploitative or something like that. And the idea that, you know, some work is exploitative and some work isn't, I think it comes from this expectation. You know, we're placing these expectations on jobs that, you know, they're providing something more than just an incentive for you to do the thing. So yeah, Bethany, go ahead.
Yeah, two things. So one small thing is just that, of course, in like college education, typically you aren't really producing anything for other people. I mean, other than that they might enjoy teaching you, but the product is really there for the student, unlike an internship. But the other thing I wanted to say is there's cool data, and I wish I could remember like where I heard about this so I could look up the details, but basically there are people who have analyzed certain features of education to try to make this point that it's partly about like signaling rather than just sort of as Avi was saying, rather than just the concrete things that you're learning. So one of the things that I remember is that each year is not equal. So it matters a lot whether you finish college, obviously. Like you get a lot less credit for the first 3 years than you do sort of an extra bonus for that finishing that last year. And why that is important to the point is that like if you were really thinking like, oh, you're learning skills as you complete each year, and that's the main thing people care about, then you might think that it wouldn't matter so much, like each year would be valuable to a like roughly equal extent. But instead, what really matters is that you graduate and get the degree, and you get almost no credit in terms of the job market, you get a lot less credit for doing 3 out of 4 years or something like that. So I think that's to your point also, Avi, that it's not just like about, for the employer, it's not just about the concrete things that you're actually learning, but rather something else. So just want to throw that out there. We're kind of doing an education and basic income and employment one.
Yeah. I think it's a really good point that the student is more clearly the customer who's paying for the service. But what's interesting is that a lot of times when people say, oh, people need jobs, they make arguments like, well, because it gives them meaning and purpose and that kind of thing. But when you start framing it that way, or because they need money or something like that, when you start framing it that way, then it starts to look more like the worker is the customer of this system that is creating jobs for them. So it's still not as far apart as you might think. Yeah, Mom, go ahead.
So this is still on the same point of education, and what Avi said about, if this last year is designed as an internship for work, when really what is school for? It's for learning. You're learning a skill that has to do with employment. And it wasn't, what is college for? I mean, thinking about it in those terms, now we think of it as a funnel toward a job or toward a career. But it wasn't always that way. It was about learning. I mean, in a kind of more pure form. Who takes just, history, liberal arts, humanities majors are really going down. People are not taking them. And that's because they don't lead anywhere. They don't lead to jobs. Yeah. Usually, unless they're teaching. But I think in, maybe in the time when there was more hierarchical societal things, and people would who had money could just go and learn and be educated, be the educated class, and not tie it to jobs. They didn't need the money, so they could learn, and then they'd go abroad and they'd do stuff that had to do with, broadening their horizons. That was also a big thing. But that's not the way education now is. It really is tied to a job, and the resume, the employment, and what you say. It's really kind of striking to think of it that way, because you really have to invest sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars in order to get your resume at the top of the pile. It's basically what happens. That's all.
I wonder if we're going to see more experimentation and creativity and flexibility in education once it's all moved online as a result of something.
Well, if people don't have to worry so much, that too, but if people don't have to worry so much about money, I mean, basic income does come into play in that sense. If you do have more leisure time, you can actually use it for learning without worrying about, achieving the right grade and the right job.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's also true that, in kind of normal times, society wants poor people to go out there and get a job. And right now, as of the last few days, society now wants poor people to stay home and stay out of public spaces and kind of just hunker down at home, stay out of doing anything in the outside world. So now the incentives that we are setting up for people are going to be different. Now we're talking about sending people checks and stuff like that. But then the question we can ask is, why did we want the incentive to be the other way previously? And is this something that we're just like it takes a crisis of this kind and magnitude for us to realize that the jobs are harmful in this particular way? Like the jobs are harmful in that they spread the pandemic and that kind of thing. Are we going to realize that maybe jobs are bad for the environment? If they're not actually necessary. Maybe jobs are bad for people if they take away their freedom. That kind of thing. I wonder if this change is going to help us start thinking about what the labor market is really for, and which kind of jobs we actually want. Yeah, go ahead, Bethany.
Well, I guess two things. One, unfortunately, I'm not sure if that will happen because it's so confounded right now with things that we usually would want people to be doing not happening. Like we usually want some people in restaurants and in the UPS office or whatever, and now we don't want anybody doing anything. But that's not really. So it's easy to just think like, oh, this is only because we have to, but really we would like this activity to be happening, their job activity. It's just that right now we have to make that sacrifice. The other thing I was going to say is, this is just on the education point again, but it's interesting that the sort of quote unquote more elite universities like Harvard still don't offer, very pointedly don't offer classes or majors that are related to work. So they don't offer journalism, business, any of those things. You can't take pre-law or whatever. Like I only know through the grapevine from other schools that these are actually majors at other schools. But they still keep the model of like having, like you would go, and I think it's a costly signaling kind of thing because basically it still helps you to get a job to go to Harvard anyway. Like you kind of are showing you don't need that training, kind of to Avi's point again about that, but also that you're very likely to go on to grad school if you do need that kind of training. So it's kind of like a moot point whether you majored in like, it matters a little bit what you major in, don't get me wrong, like economics majors probably make a little more in their jobs than English majors, but it's not as much as you might think. And they actively don't offer the more like officially job-oriented majors. So as much as people are saying like college is becoming about that, the like Harvard, where I am, kind of holds on to this other idea of education for its own sake, even though it's clearly relevant to getting a job, either directly or through getting people into med school, law school. I mean, there's huge feeder pipes for like consulting or iBanking that come out of Harvard. And like, to be honest, they don't really care, especially consulting, like what your major was. And so it's again to this point that like they care about things that you're signaling, like your grades and stuff. So they do care about things like people's work ethic, but it's not a very direct, like I'm learning skills that I can then go on and do and use. They're trying to find intelligent, hardworking, responsible people, basically. And they're using it as a sort of a way of figuring out who those people are. So I just thought that was interesting in light of what Joan and other people were saying. But we can move off the education point if we want. I just thought I'd add that.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a lot of it is very much a credentialing system. So rather than training people for the job, Harvard is performing the role of filter. Now, obviously, they're educating people too, and I think people come out of Harvard more enriched than they were when they went in.
I don't want to downplay it too much. I mean, you learn how to think logically, you learn how to write better. Like as they argue, you learn a lot of skills that are kind of widely applicable to a lot of jobs. And their point is like that's their role. And then if you need something more specified, you either get it on the job or in grad school. And I think that does kind of make sense. But yeah, there's also a lot of credentialing going on.
Yeah. Whoops, I muted myself. Avi, go ahead.
So two things real quickly on the education thing. I guess we're beating down on this a lot, but I feel like people who do make it to like an Ivy League school, like, Harvard or Cornell or something, probably don't have to worry about being unemployed after. So they almost have like the privilege of, being able to choose whatever major they feel like without worrying for a job. Whereas for maybe less accredited or less like unknown schools, like you have to say that, oh, I'm actually like, doing something, that will lead to a job just to kind of avoid unemployment. But going back to your initial question about why we were so kind of like economically unprepared for, a pandemic like the coronavirus, I think a large part of it stems down to the fact that people know the economy is kind of like messed up and the way things we are doing things are messed up, but they also are going to go for their self-interests first before going for like what's objectively good as a country. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think generally speaking, individual people are going to act in their own self-interest, and this is part of the reason why we have government, right? To kind of set the parameters and set the incentives to align people's self-interested motives with what's actually good for society. That's part of government. Go ahead, Derek.
Well, so I mean, Alex pointed out that when this virus hits, the incentive changes, and then it's a good opportunity to ask questions about, well, why did we have the other incentive in place so strongly? And well, two things about that. One, it's important because there's a window of opportunity to ask that question because the default assumption is going to be that we can go back to the normal thing. But I kind of wonder, I'd like to hear your guys' thoughts on this question. Like, why did we get this incentive so strongly in place culturally? I know that Alex has talked about how once macroeconomic policy becomes a thing, we get a formal full employment target that we're trying to hit, and we're using policy to do this. Prior to that, I assume that there wasn't that going on, and then people simply relied on poverty to basically provide enough employment, and we just sort of assumed whoever was getting the jobs, that was sufficient for what society needed. I mean, what causes this? Like, how old is this assumption that society should be fully employed?
Yeah, go ahead, Bethany.
I'd like to know more of the history here, but I think that part of it is bottom up in the sense that employment starts with people just wanting to like pay other people to do things for them. And that's kind of how money starts. And for those of, or that's what, one of the major things that money is used for, not the only thing. And I think I'm a little fuzzy on the details, but one of the things I thought was interesting about what Carl Weidicus brought my attention to last time, if some of you were able to like watch that or listen to that one, is that, eventually more and more of the way that people are surviving is based on earning money rather than having, a farm or some other option, or being a slave or serf or something like that. And so basically it seems like it makes sense that the government would come in and see a system that's kind of already working in a certain way, like people getting paid to leave the farm and like go to factories and this and that. And then they just want to like tweak it at the margins to try to make it work for everybody, by increasing employment or, bailing out people who are unemployed or this kind of thing. So it sort of makes sense to me that it would sort of emerge in that direction. It's, even if it's not the most efficient way, because it feels like a less interference by the government in a certain sense. It's like there's a system working on its own organically, and then you just add. But then eventually, you're adding a lot, right? You're adding like minimum wage and rules and work weeks and trying to boost employment. And at a certain point, the government is intervening quite a lot. But you can see how it's kind of happening in stages. Where it looks like it's just tweaking the margins of the system that is happening on its own, of people paying each other to do work. Whereas the idea of just giving people money as the government almost feels like a different system, as opposed to tweaking like this organic system. I don't know if that makes any sense to Alex or other people, but it's not so surprising to me that we ended up here, even outside of like good theory for thinking about it.
Yeah, and I think it's useful to notice that the ways in which we tweaked the system to kind of make up for these problems that kind of keep cropping up is that we use economic policy to indirectly hand people money. So you're setting parameters on the market, or you're making it easier for businesses to lend, that kind of thing. So we kind of have this stimulating the financial sector. I talk about this a lot. Stimulating the financial sector to create jobs, to push money to consumers. Like over time like Bethany was saying. This system of everybody kind of producing their own stuff and then trading with each other, and then everyone being better off. That's not how it works anymore. As we scale up and as we specialize, there are some people who produce a lot more than they consume, and there are some people who consume a lot more than they produce. And the people who are consumers, who are like net consumers, they need a source of spending money. So we've come up with kind of this hodgepodge of various mechanisms to get spending money into the hands of consumers, and it's kind of piggybacked on these social expectations or assumptions about the value of work, and that kind of stuff, the value of jobs, and keeping the economy fully employed. Like like you could imagine, everybody living in tribes, small scale societies, that, if you take that economy as a whole, then everybody working is the same thing as the economy producing everything it can, or some notion of everybody working. Obviously, you're still not going to have, sick people or elderly people work, probably, unless you're coming up against a real, resource constraint or something like that. But yeah, you could have this intuition that that worked. And if you never dropped that intuition as we specialize and as we kind of centralize our production, then you're going to miss what's happening. You're going to miss what's changing, which is that, you know, there are these producers that are producing goods and services for the people, and the goods and services are flowing to consumers, and then the money is flowing in the other direction. So yeah, I mean, the job becomes no longer about needing people to contribute anymore, except in this kind of like social expectation kind of way. Yeah, Bethany.
Just a small point. My vague sense is that in small scale societies, you do have some people contributing more than, obviously you do have some people contributing more than they consume and some people consuming more than they contribute. And because it's so small scale, they just managed to solve that without forcing people to do like useless stuff as a way to like earn their take, whatever. And I'm not just saying older people or kids. Like, I think some people are just better hunters and they actually get a larger share of the food for the community, and then that ends up being shared, and they kind of incentivize that person in other sort of social ways to do that, et cetera. But it works in a different way on a small scale, but some of the same problem is there. And as I think you said, Derek often talks about, like, here we're mostly strangers, we can't solve it in like these subtle social ways. So we need some other way to solve it.
Yeah, I think that's right. Derek?
I was going to say something similar. I like that a lot. I wanted to note that it is actually a kind of an open anthropological question. How close to full employment was a society like that? And I've definitely read some articles that seem to suggest that under certain conditions of sufficient natural abundance, that the work week would be equivalent to something like a 3-day work week from what we're used to, and the rest of the time you spend sort of like, you know, hanging out and grooming and performing rituals and doing other things. And yeah, it's interesting to think about, because depending on how that question is answered, we might ask then, we might wonder how surprising it is that we've ended up in this situation, right? How kind of natural is it that we've found our way here?
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and it kind of speaks to what we were mentioning earlier, where the notion of what it means to be employed is kind of defined at some level by social expectations too. So they might have thought of themselves, I mean, they probably didn't have the term employed, but they might have thought of themselves as, you know, like contributing sufficiently and, you know, that kind of thing. And you've got, you know, your social incentives and expectations, and people are contributing the right amount of work. And the tribe itself, as, you know, as a unit can be self-sufficient in the ways that they allocate their time and energy and labor and that kind of thing. But you know, when you get to the modern world, it's no longer the case that, you know, small groups of people have the option of kind of going out and subsisting on their own. If everybody did that, then we would be using resources really inefficiently, and, you know, we would destroy the carrying capacity of the planet and waste all our resources. So the fact that we have optimized so much, that we've, you know, our gains from trade and specialization have allowed us to increase the carrying capacity of the planet beyond what's possible when groups of people are just being self-sufficient. So there's no longer even the option for, or the possibility for that kind of arrangement anymore. At least, you know, maybe one group could do it, but not like at any large scale. Yeah. So, Mom, go ahead.
I was just thinking about that, the small scale and the large scale. So on a small scale, in a group where everybody's working, you can kind of see what's going on. I mean, you can see who's working more, who's working less, what they're doing, and that sort of thing. And once we are beyond being able to see what's happening, I mean, then we have AI and production that goes beyond what any one person could do. And we're not really able to scale it in a way, I mean, respond to that scale of things in a way that we could have when we could see and measure what were people working at and how much were they producing. We're really blind to that now. And so all of these jobs that you call bullshit jobs, or not you, but a lot of people, I mean, the job then takes precedence. The identity idea takes precedence over the actual production of things and the actual consumption of things, because we can't see that really.
Right, we can't see it, but in some ways, the market can see it. If we had an efficient labor market, then it would be incentivizing the right amount of work, kind of in aggregate, and the right kinds of work. But as you say, it would still be the case that the individual people are they're still not going to see it. It's a matter of like, oh, this is what I have to do to get money. And then the market kind of figures that out through supply and demand. But we don't have an efficient labor market right now because we impose all these restrictions on it. We want to make sure we're trying to get to full employment, and we're trying to ensure that people have certain minimum wage or living wage or something, like the kinds of things that we're fighting for when it comes to labor and the job market are things that distort the labor market away from being maximally efficient. So in an efficient labor market, we only hire people to work if we actually want the output of the labor. That's the only like businesses. That's true of businesses now, but the government stimulates the businesses and keeps the businesses afloat. So yeah, in an efficient labor market, jobs only exist because we want the product of the labor, and the only purpose of wages is to provide an incentive for people to perform that labor. So it's not about providing people a living or anything like that. And I don't think there's really been any time in history where somehow magically the amount of wages in an efficient labor market were sufficient to kind of activate the full capacity of the economy. So I want to get to the next quote here. It takes us in a little bit of a different direction. Yeah, bring it up. Okay. So essentially, the idea of full employment is that so few workers are available that companies need to begin raising wages to attract help. Economists technically define full employment as any time a country has a jobless rate equal or below what is known as the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, which goes by the soporific acronym NAIRU. So this is a really interesting thing, partly because the way we've set up the economy now, where people need jobs in order to have incomes, like the way they get their incomes is through wages, it kind of makes it true. So if you are, so I mean, even in an efficient labor market, there's, if you try to get businesses to compete for workers, then that's going to drive wages up, and wages are going to be related to other prices and that kind of thing. But then there's this idea that driving wages up is bad, and if you drive wages up for so let me back up a second. If the economy needs people to have more income, then the intuition is not that higher wages are automatically bad. If people had more money to spend, then they'd be able to activate more of the economy. But it is also true that if wages are the way we get people their income, and the wages are unevenly distributed, partly because the jobs are unevenly distributed, then you have a situation where there are people with no incomes. If people are getting their income from jobs, then the people who are unemployed have no incomes, or no incomes in kind of like the expected way that you would want people to have their incomes. So then you've got this trade-off that you have to make between employing more people and driving up all the prices through kind of this not only making labor more expensive, but also skewing the incomes. Like the way you do it is you stimulate the financial sector, and that creates a lot more borrowing, and you get these asset bubbles like we saw in 2008. Like it's like all of this stuff is like this thinking makes sense. There is kind of this if all you're doing is thinking about employment and controlling employment, and that's the only way they get their wages, the only way people get their incomes, excuse me, then yeah, there's going to be a level of employment where, a level of unemployment where if you fall below that, then you're going to have uncontrollable inflation that keeps accelerating, and there's nothing you can do about it unless you ease off. It's in an efficient labor market. If we actually did have an efficient labor market, some people wouldn't be working at all, right? What matters is that the incentives are such that the right amount of labor is being performed in the economy, and the right kinds of labor are being performed in the economy. It doesn't matter whether any one person happens to be working or not, that kind of thing. It's about the aggregate incentives. So if you start with an efficient labor market and you try to push it around in this way to stimulate jobs, then you're going to have this kind of non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Now, one option could be, the option that I would advocate would be, well, let's just allow the labor market to be efficient and understand that not all of people's incomes have to come from jobs. The only portion of their incomes that have to come from jobs are the amount that's necessary to incentivize the labor. So we lower the basic income. So by default, people get a basic income. Everyone gets a basic income at the maximum possible level, and we only lower that amount to create labor market incentives so people can go out and earn the money, kind of what I was saying before. So that's one option. That's what I would advocate. And then another option is to distort the labor market even further. So to ensure that jobs are not allocated based on, okay, this person can actually be productive, and there's supply and demand and stuff like that. Just ensuring that creating jobs more explicitly. So we already use monetary policy to create jobs, and other economic policy to kind of like stimulate job creation, that kind of thing. But we can just cut to the chase and literally create jobs for people, right? They're not necessarily productive jobs. Some of them might be, to the extent that the economy is not hiring people to do work that needs doing. You can use this as an excuse to get necessary work done. But if you have an efficient labor market and the government is putting all the resources it needs to put in and hiring all the labor it needs to hire to get all the things done that it needs to do, then if you're creating jobs beyond that, if you're creating jobs for the purpose of pushing people income, then you're not creating because you want the product of the labor. Yeah, go ahead, Avi.
I think part of the issue is that the government in large relies on income taxes in order to generate revenue, rather than relying on an efficient economy. So if we did switch from whatever economy we have now to an economy that's 100% efficient, what will happen is these companies will make a lot more profit while individuals will make less profit, or at least net, they'll make less profit. And since the government's relying on individual incomes in order to generate revenue, I would argue that at least in the taxation model that we have now, the government will net make less profits. Like, that's why personally I'm a big proponent of what's called like a value added tax, where you would make sure that companies or such are actually paying their taxes, as opposed to Amazon or Apple, who just hoard money in the Cayman Islands or like Ireland or whatever in order to avoid taxes. So I feel like step one has to be having like a mechanism in order to gain money from companies' profits before switching to a UBI, or at least that's how I view things.
Yeah, I think it's worth asking the question, what makes it possible for the government to spend money? So if they spend more money than there is stuff for them to buy, then that's going to cause inflation, right? So there's kind of a limit to how much money they can spend there. And then you can ask the question, I've written a few blog posts on this, then you can ask the question, if you introduce something like a tax, does that somehow allow the government to buy more stuff? Does it create conditions in which the government can spend more money into the economy because there's more stuff available for them to buy? And I would say that it depends on the tax. So if you are taxing carbon emissions, for example, now what you're doing is you're making a certain resource in the economy more expensive for businesses to use. So that kind of tax would be inflationary. And I would say that the same thing is true of a VAT. So a VAT is kind of a tax on all production in the economy. So you're making it more expensive for producers to produce. So I would say that just on its own, if you introduced a VAT into the economy, I would say that is likely to reduce the amount of basic income we can afford rather than increase it. I think another way of asking this question is, how much money could the government spend right now without increasing any taxes, and not have any problems? And it'll depend on where they spend the money and that kind of thing. But these kinds of questions are useful to ask. And I think once you start thinking about them, you might it might even lead to more questions. I've written a lot of stuff about this, but I don't want to get into too much of it now. Yeah, Derek, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about this idea of the NAIRU, and correct me if I'm wrong. The idea seems to be suggesting that if we achieve this non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, that this will, and when we don't exceed that, then we'll be in a kind of a sweet spot where we are motivating wages up. That's the idea, that companies will have to raise wages in order to attract the workers.
Not exactly. It's more, well, I mean, they talk about it in various different ways, but my understanding of how it actually works is that if you set up your economy in such a way that people are forced to get their incomes from wages, and you allow the labor market to be at least somewhat efficient, then there's going to be some level of unemployment where if you tried to employ more people, if you tried to spend money on employing more people, then that would force the employers to compete for the remaining workers, and it would drive up wages and other prices in the economy. And that's something that's true, right? Like if you are forcing people to get their money from jobs, and you're not like designing some completely market-free system where the wages have nothing to do with incentives, then you're going to end up in a situation where some people just don't have jobs and don't have incomes, or it's and you can't really get around that without kind of completely creating some kind of disconnect between job creation and the need for or the incentive to kind of produce some kind of output or something like that. So yeah, I kind of like in my head, I think about the labor market as kind of this uneven thing where there's some people who are earning a lot of money, and then there are people on the outside who aren't earning very much, and then some people who just don't have jobs and aren't earning any money, and that's kind of an efficient labor market. So if you stimulate that and try to get more labor and then or try to get more jobs than what is efficient, it's going to cause inflation. So you have NAIRU. It comes from it naturally falls out of the way we structure our economy. If we didn't have if we had basic income, right, and if we had there would still be NAIRU, but we wouldn't think of people being jobless as necessarily a problem anymore. And depending on where you define, what's an acceptable job, what counts as unemployment, then maybe it's possible to raise the basic income high enough that everybody who wants a job has one, because you've raised it high enough that the people who didn't have jobs no longer want to go get one anymore because they have enough money, right? So I think that's kind of where the NAIRU comes from. It's just yeah, and the MMT people, they talk about a jobs guarantee, and that that's the way of getting around it. That kind of blasts away the labor market, and then the basic income is the way of saying, hey, we can uncouple people's incomes from jobs and leave wages to just be an incentive mechanism. Yeah, go ahead, Derek.
Oh, well, yeah, no, I'm familiar. I understand the way that you look at it too, and I've heard a little bit of the MMT people talk about NIRA, but I wanted to understand in the mainstream view, like, so it's basically the hypothetical upper limit of how far we can keep pushing employment before you get inflation.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I guess I went on too long there.
No. Yeah. I was wondering because the implication it seemed would be that, well, if you get an optimal amount of employment, that we're going to have wages kind of be pressured up, but not causing it like wage push inflation. But of course, like I think we've all seen the graph showing that real wages have stagnated for like half a century, right? So,
right. So there's a difference between, economists consider like steady inflation, like, oh, it's always 2%, that might be okay, or even other levels of steady inflation might be okay. But as soon as the inflation is accelerating, then that's a problem. So that's why they talk about the non-accelerating rate of unemployment. But you could have, the non-inflationary rate of unemployment at all. And my guess is that they would actually be the same thing, because once inflation is, kind of at a steady level, it's at your target, then it if it's just staying there, then it's kind of a wash. So one level of inflation that's not accelerating could just be zero. Yeah, I think the idea that you want to target a kind of small positive rate of inflation with monetary policy is somewhat of a separate concept from NAIRU, but NAIRU accommodates that. There's different arguments for why you would want a small amount of inflation, and NAIRU is designed to accommodate that rather than just having like, oh, what is the inflation-free rate of unemployment? Does that make sense?
yeah, no, that'll make sense.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone have any more thoughts? Actually, let's see. See if I have a good quote here. I want to find a good quote to end on. Oh yeah, this I guess is a good one. Sorry we didn't get to the second article, but I would encourage people to check it out. It's a little bit longer, and it provides some of the some kind of slightly different perspectives and that kind of thing. So this quote, estimates of the measure are based on the historical relationship between the unemployment rate and changes in the pace of inflation. If unemployment rate is below this number, the economy is at full employment, businesses cannot easily find workers, and inflation and wages typically rise. If not, then there are too many workers in need of a job and inflation remains low. So I highlighted this quote because I wanted to point out the danger of going, just looking at data and looking at trends and kind of trying to draw conclusions from that. So I think this is, William Phillips and the Phillips curve, created this this idea about, kind of a relationship between, unemployment levels and inflation. And this is kind of playing off that. And historically, you do see that, maybe like, as you pointed out, Derek, about with wage stagnation, maybe less so in the last few decades. But historically, there was a relationship. But if you don't dig deeper and think about what's causing this relationship, then you can start. Then you might make the mistake of thinking that it's a natural law or something like that. And really, like I was saying, it's a consequence of of the fact that we tie people's incomes to jobs. Yeah, so it's only natural in the state of nature that we have designed for the economy. Yeah, so let's see. Why don't we, we're getting toward the end. Why don't we go around and get final thoughts? I'm not going to lose track of the order this time. I'm looking at like 3 different screens, and you guys are all in different positions on different screens. So I'll focus on this one. So Steve, I kind of want to hear from you first, since you've been somewhat quiet during this.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, if all jobs were automated, then nobody would need a job, and everybody would be happy. So to the extent that we can automate jobs, it seems like it addresses a lot of these employment issues. That's all.
Yeah, so we'll go to Derek and then Avi.
It was an interesting discussion. I think we've examined a lot of problems with the idea of full employment being central to the economy. And I mean, increasingly, the more I think about it, the more I feel like it's kind of would almost be a useful measure in the opposite, that we would want to try to see how much we could keep productivity and output, increasing or maintaining while decreasing the level of formal employment, so that people would have more room for informal employment or non-employment.
Yeah, sounds good to me. Maximizing leisure. So we'll go Avi and then Bethany.
So my final thoughts on this is that, I feel like as a country, we emphasize employment too much. So definitely trying to, it would be nice to have at least a way to kind of weave in some, some non like quantifiable things like volunteer work or just like leisure time into the economy in order to kind of get like a good balance between, where the economy's working and what's really best for us as a populace. But yeah, overall, I thought it was a great discussion.
All right, Bethany and then Mom.
Yeah, I liked some of these thoughts about how we would try to measure bang for your buck, in a sense, like amount of productivity that we're getting with minimum employment, because that, I think when you measure something, that can be powerful. So that's an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, Mom.
Great discussion. As usual, I like the especially the idea of what is employment and the tying in of employment to education. I think that's an important topic, but all of it was good. Thanks.
Yeah, and it looks like whoever's the 616 number and Mitchell, well, Mitchell doesn't have his audio set up, and whoever's the 616 number, feel free to chime in. I'm actually not quite sure how the dial-ins work for this, or whether you can kind of unmute yourself because it looks like you're muted. Yeah, I have to look into how to manage the phone stuff. Maybe I can just unmute you now. Yeah, I don't know. I unmuted whoever's on the phone, 616. Have anything to say? Going once, going twice. Okay, you're gone. Okay, so yeah, I think this was a good discussion, and I think it's hard. This is the idea that more jobs are better, keeping everyone employed, or trying to reach a kind of a healthy level of employment for a robust economy or something like that, is that's kind of ingrained. We take that for granted, or a lot of people in our society take that for granted. So in order to really be able to talk about something like basic income without kind of like fudging it and saying like, oh, but it actually will create jobs, it's actually good for jobs, good for workers, that kind of thing, it takes having to look at things with a different perspective and having to reevaluate some of those assumptions that we take for granted about the nature of work. And I think Derek is right that we should want to maximize leisure. That's maximizing freedom, and maybe people will lose some of their meaning and purpose that they currently get from jobs. And maybe we would want to put resources into addressing that and providing them with ways to have meaningful lives or meaningful activities and that kind of thing. But then at least we would be recognizing that we're doing it for that purpose. We're no longer pretending that that people are contributing to some kind of economic output or something like that. And then once you're doing that, I imagine that for most people, the kinds of activities that we create for them are not going to look like the things that we call jobs today. We can do better than that. If we're trying to design like an ideal life for someone, most of the jobs that we have in our society would not be the things that we would design. And I don't think we would call it jobs anymore. At least my hope is that we would have some terminology to distinguish between the labor market, paying people to get them to do things, and these benefits. You could even call it entertainment that we provide for other people. Maybe there's a lot more athletes or something like that, or just a lot more academics and or just people who are doing things and we have no idea of really what they're doing with their time, and we don't understand it, and then it turns out they came up with the theory of relativity, right? I mean, like there are many valuable activities that society would have never thought to pay for, and would have maybe if they were judging that person on whether they were being productive, would have prevented that person from doing that thing. So we need to be very careful about withholding basic income from people and providing this incentive to join the labor market, because there's an opportunity cost there. We're giving something up, and what we're giving up can be very hard to estimate and very hard to quantify. So we should be fairly confident that that what we want to employ people to do, if we're the government, or what we want to stimulate the market to produce, is worth it, is worth taking away people's freedom in this way. So yeah, I mean, I think you see some of the mainstream arguments about basic income, and they try to fit it into this kind of intuitive narrative that this ingrained narrative about how the economy works and how the labor market works and how jobs work. But if we really want to understand basic income, and we really want to understand the problem it solves, which is getting spending money to consumers so they can benefit from the economy, and that it has nothing to do with really kind of creating jobs or anything like that, then that's the only way we're really going to be able to kind of understand basic income on a deeper level, I think. So yeah, this is something I think about a lot, and it's an interesting question of how to shift people's mindset on this. And I always cringe a little bit when I hear basic income advocates kind of taking the shortcut of playing into people's narratives about jobs. It's not about jobs. It's about people. It's about consumers benefiting from the economy. So thanks, guys. This was great. Next week, we are going to be talking about Andrew Yang's legacy. So he certainly brought basic income up to the public consciousness. But I also think he took some of these shortcuts that make me uncomfortable. And we can really get into some of that kind of stuff. Like he talks about automation and it being some kind of crisis because it's eliminating jobs, which of course plays into the mainstream narrative, even if it is a little bit far out for some people. But I like to say that automation is calling attention to the fact that the labor market was never the right way to push money to consumers. It's only for getting people to do things. That's the only extent to which you need to pay people in the labor market. So thanks, guys. This was the first time that we've done this format. So thanks for hanging in there. I'm sorry if some of the quotes were not very readable. And we'll see how the YouTube stream turns out, because it looks like all of our faces were in different places, and some things that were happening on my screen were not happening on the stream, and that kind of thing. But we'll figure this out, and next week is going to be even better. And I'm excited about bringing in more people to these discussions on an equal level, instead of having just kind of like names and text on a live stream. So let me know. Let me know if you have any feedback or you'd like to see anything different coming forward or coming up in the future. Yeah.
Thanks, Alex.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
I'm gonna stop the live stream on YouTube now. End stream.